Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Besides Bree, Brian's bestie in high school, 2, possibly 3 women have emerged as being romantically linked to Brian Kohberger. The latest and most unlikely is Brittany J. Hislop. We already know about Hayley Willett, Kohberger's Tinder date back in 2015. But how many know about Kim Kennelly, Kohberger's cheerleader girlfriend? Well, in truth, he liked her and she became a cheerleader later. But even though for Kennelly feelings were never mutual when it came to Brian, she nevertheless provides some very important insight into Brian's loveless love life. According to the Daily Mail, quote, Kohberger started to develop a crush on Kennelly when they were 6th grade students at Pleasant Valley Intermediate School in Brodheadsville, Pennsylvania. Kennelly, who went on to become a high school cheerleader, says Kohberger began to pursue her romantically. According to Kennelly's mother, Kohberger was a chubby, awkward child who pursued her daughter relentlessly. He would repeatedly leave love letters in her locker and tell her he liked her. Now, we've come across this aspect regarding Brian previously, his persistence. Persistence can be a good thing after all. I mean, faint heart never won fair lady. But when persistence becomes obsession and obsession fixation, isn't it a case of tainted heart never won fair lady? Or in Brian's case, overweight heart never won fair lady.
But I have other virtues, Father. Ambition. That can be a virtue when it drives us to excel. Resourcefulness, courage. Perhaps not on the battlefield, but there are many forms of courage. Devotion to my family, to you. But none of my virtues won your list.
According to Kennelly's mother, he would always say, "Oh, Kim, I think you're very pretty." Just like weird comments. And she'd say, "Oh my God, leave me alone." That's according to her mother, Sandra. And apparently her daughter did not give Brian the time of day. And she said, when kids are little, they're mean. And they don't say, "Oh my God, thank you, but no." And so that gives us a peek into Brian's situation, right, as a high school kid. And it's clear that throughout Brian's backstory, being rejected by the fairer sex was sort of a loaded dice, and it was a burden that he was carrying that seemed to be getting heavier no matter how much weight he lost or how high he scaled the ladders of academia. And I think it's important to take that knowledge into this whole idea of the eyes of a killer. We're going to look at 5 highlights from Part 2 of Howard Blum's expose. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'll be doing a deeper dive into the Idaho case, looking at the semantics, the statements that Dee made. And I'll also be covering, in terms of the Rust incident, we're going to be looking at some footage you may not have seen before and some evidence you may not have seen before, including, and I find this very touching, Helena Hutchins' shirt. And that sort of echoes the analysis I've just done on the Murdoch case. In terms of this episode, if you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So it's a very long form article, but the part that really stood out to me, I really liked his turn of phrase, he's a pretty good writer, is the Great Trash Robbery. And that's the first of the 5 points I want to highlight. I love the bit about the Great Trash Robbery. Trash turned out to be a treasure trove, according to BLUM. And Kohberger was surveilled cleaning his car, throwing trash in neighbors' cans, and wearing gloves at 4 a.m. And all of that is not a good look for him, right? How many people do you know who throw out the Christmas trash sort of at 4 a.m. in the morning? Most people tend to sleep extra late during that time. And according to the article, a shrewd agent, Pennsylvania State Police Major Chris Paris, he was apparently handpicked by the FBI to run the state operation And on December 27th, he was ordered to search those garbage cans. It's kind of an interesting thing that you end up doing. You know, you're handpicked by the FBI and you end up searching garbage cans. And credit to them. I mean, they found something in those garbage cans. They found something of evidentiary value. And one wonders if they'd searched garbage cans in terms of the Murdoch case, what could have come out of that. Anyway, BLUM also provides further details on the circumstances surrounding Brian getting from A to B during that cross-continental drive, or rather Pullman to Albrightsville, Pullman, Washington to Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Well, surprise, surprise, Brian didn't take a predictable direct route. He didn't take the shortest route, just as he didn't between Moscow and Pullman on the night of the murders. So we're going to go through 4 more points, and some of what emerges out of this might be news to you, might be insight and information you weren't aware of. So number 2, according to BLUM, agents apparently completely lost track of the Elantra for several alarming hours. And this may be why the decision was taken when they caught up to the Elantra to pull it over and find out for sure that the people inside were the people they were looking for and where the heck the occupants were headed. Now, it may also be why during one press conference the chief admitted to not having any idea where the suspect was. That may have technically been true there and then. Number 3, the cops actually lost him on the trail to Pennsylvania because he'd driven south on the I-70 versus a direct route on the I-90. That little detour added a solid 8 hours and more than 300 extra miles to an already massive transcontinental trip. So he's going to quite a lot of effort to possibly throw pursuers off his trail. But then law enforcement got lucky. In Loma, Colorado, it's a tiny town which got its first traffic light in 2015. And there's a camera, I think, based at this traffic camera at the intersection of Route 6 and 139. And it was on December 13 that this particular camera caught Koberger's white Elantra and the Pennsylvania license plate. Now, one does wonder, was an all points bulletin out, and is that how that information got relayed back to HQ? I mean, it's one thing for that Elantra to go through that intersection. How did that information get back to HQ? Anyway, Brian's dad, Michael, is driving with him, and he has no suspicion that they are being tailed by federal agents. It doesn't say much for either his father or his own attention to detail. Do you not notice someone driving behind you for hours, for many, many, many miles on end? Number 4, on December 15, this is 2 days after this traffic light in Loma, Colorado captured them. 2 days later, Brian receives an emergency ping on his phone, and that is due to the Washington State University being surrounded by police SWAT teams, sort of like an internal communique to all WSU students, and it informs them that 36-year-old Brent Kopacka has been killed after threatening, while armed, to shoot his roommates. And so Koberger's father would later mention this during this Indiana highway stop that same day. So the day that this happened was the day that they were stopped. And that brings us to the 5th and final point. The Indiana highway traffic stops were conducted 9 minutes apart. You may remember I suggested that it was hours apart based on the actual timestamp in that, but according to the author, it was 9 minutes apart. I don't know whether I accept that. Just because BLUM believes that, I don't know whether that necessarily makes it factual, but anyway, there you have it. And then he also says they were apparently made in innocence by state troopers with no knowledge of federal operations. I don't know whether I believe that either. It's possible that the feds didn't ask them to do anything. It's possible that somebody else did ask them, especially losing track of them. But I suppose it is possible that you had a situation like this. Blum compares them to an Abbott and Costello routine, the law enforcement officers. Now, in terms of the accessory theory, why would Brian's father mention the WSU event unless Brian had mentioned it to him? And why would Brian mention it to his father if he was going to so much trouble to avoid being caught? Why would Brian mention something that is such a critical giveaway to his guilt, an accessory? Why would he mention it to someone? I mean, if he was going home to hide away trash, why would he just mention something like that to his father? There's also another question to ask regarding this. If Brian had an accessory, I mean, someone else who actually committed the crime, why hasn't he said so? This is the same weakness that we saw in the Chris Watts case, where many believed his mistress to be involved and even more involved than he was. Well, if that were true, all what's needed to say, all what's needed to do was say that. I mean, he had nothing to lose, and likely his sentence would be mitigated. So why didn't he? Why hasn't Koberger said anything to that respect? And then there's one additional aspect I want to deal with in Blum's coverage. He refers to the FBI cellular analysis survey team mapping Koberger's movements, obviously through his phone. Excitement mounted in his words when they found his phone had been turned off at the time of the murders. Once again, the absence of evidence being evidence. Why did Brian take his phone with him? Was the idea to provide illumination inside the house in case it was dark? If he had simply left it at home and on, who knows, it would have complicated the case against him. Having his phone with him and partially tracking his movements at a certain time definitely doesn't help him. Another aspect that's quite interesting is the fact that the drive home had been pre-planned. Having his dad with him, the two could theoretically do the drive home a lot quicker than with only one driver. Blum also notes that the background to the father-son relationship was filled with old antagonisms from the father's side based on past heroin abuse, in terms of his son, for which Papa Koberger had arranged and perhaps had to pay for rehab, but also his own problems, the 2 bankruptcies and a dead-end maintenance job. What did Brian think about his father's ambition or lack of? What did Brian think of the family's struggles? As Blum notes, despite these struggles, Dad seemed to be proud and hopeful about his son coming out the other side, shiny and new, spick and span, their golden boy done good. Except maybe not. Maybe there was a chip or a splinter somewhere in all of that past dysfunction.
No one's ever really gone.
Is the past ever really past? So maybe there was a chip or a splinter somewhere in all of that past dysfunction that had somehow opened up old wounds and they had been allowed to fester. Did bad Teachergate help with that, help that process along? And if Brian had started using again, then maybe in a strange way, Brian hadn't really come so far after all. And, driving in the car with his dad, was he really an authentic son? Or was he a fraud? Was the golden Brian real? Or was he a fraud? And if he committed these despicable crimes, maybe Brian was painfully aware of the excruciating fall that preceded his actual fall, a fall back into the depths of social death and despair that he had to have realized he'd never really managed to escape. Does that make sense? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.